All right, so when you're working with the REPC, the vast majority of the time, which contract are we actually using? Just the standard REPC, okay? Heather, what REPC did you get introduced to lately?
The land.
Yes. So if you go on the MLS and their forms and just type in REPC, it's a little kerfuffle because everywhere they use the initials REPC, it shows up. We're actually going to bring up the new construction, the real estate purchase contract. We're going to look at the commercial briefly. Land. Oops, that's the addendum. I want to move that one. Yep. Because these are all used in certain ways. We're going to spend most of our time, obviously, on the standard REPC that we're used to, the real estate purchase contract. But let's take a look at these other ones. You what?
I just realized you just made a packet. So I went and pulled them all up individually for each form. For this land deal.
Okay, yeah, in the MLS, if you're using multiple forms, you can just click the plus button and then make a packet.
Perfect.
And I only know this because in the old days, we'd have to do everything on this first and then stick it in dot loop or whatever the signature program was. And so you just kind of get into the habit. Okay. I want to go down to the new construction one to start with. And there's a reason for this. Yes, it exists. Your odds of using this are pretty low. The new construction REPC can only be used on a property that is either to be built or under construction. Once the structure is completed and there is a certificate of occupancy issued by the city or the county, whoever the zoning is with, it's considered built standing residential. So this morning, Brianna walked through a townhome with her buyers that is complete.
Hello.
And they had just had the inspection and had the COO, certificate of occupancy. So it's no longer considered new construction. It's built. It's ready for somebody to move in. So they actually use, and it's a smaller builder, so they actually use the standard REPC for the offer this morning. If they were still finishing it, we would have had to use the new construction because there are some different terms in it.
That's what I was up against last week.
Yeah.
The builder has their own contract. They don't have a certificate of occupancy yet, so it's still getting close to being finished. So, they need to sign all their special contracts.
Okay. Yep, Doug, like you said, the production builders all have their own. D.R. Horton, Richmond, Ivory, all the big ones have built their own, have their own contracts. And they'll continue to use that contract even if they're up to the point of a COO because it's their contract. But the big deciding factor on when you're ultimately when you move forward is whether or not you have that certificate of occupancy. You can't close the loan until you have it. You can have an appraisal done, you can have an inspection done, you can have everything done, but you're still waiting on that last inspection. Okay. And in fact, one of the deadlines that is very common in the new construction contract is going to be what's called, they have to send out a certificate of substantial completion to the buyer. At that point, that's stating that they're basically just waiting on the final certificate of occupancy. The building is essentially completed. An appraisal can be done. You can move forward. And then they're usually they usually put, now you're on a time clock. Now is when your financing and appraisal deadline really kicks in because now you can actually finish that step. So some unique aspects of these. Most builders are going to have a standard purchase contract that's going to go through all the terms of the purchase for a base model of the home. And if the home was listed on the MLS, it will state whether or not your compensation is on the base model or if it's base model and a lot fee or base model lot fee and upgrades.
but not well too.
What'd you learn?
Their base model price is way lower than what they're selling house for.
Base model price is way lower, and what is your commission based on?
That base price.
The base price. Where the builders make a lot of their money is in upgrades. They don't take any longer to put in, but whatever the material cost is, they're making money on. So I had a buyer, picked out a home, wanted a specific style with the builder because they looked at it online. They knew which lot they wanted. It was the only one that the home would fit on because they were planning on putting on an extended kitchen with a sunroom next to it. So you went from base model to $20,000 to add the room, plus about another 10 grand for the kitchen. Plus, because it was on a corner lot, now they had to pay a premium lot fee. They put about $100,000 upgrade on the home. You don't get paid for that. So just understand that that's going to be built in there. The primary things to look for in a builder's contract are going to be earnest money or deposit. Are they treating it as earnest money or are they treating it as a construction deposit? If it's construction deposit, many large builders like DR, Horton, and Richmond especially, as soon as they sign that check, it becomes non-refundable. The builder uses it to then make the deposit on the purchase of materials. If it's a home from ground up. If it's a quick move-in, one that's already almost finished, then the terms may be different because they already bought the materials. Okay. And they may also have, when you go in, they may ask for like a $500 check just to reserve the lot they're interested in, while it then actually goes to the review committee as to which offer is accepted.
Yeah, the earnest money that they were requiring was 3% down.
3% of base price.
Sale price.
Sale price. So all the upgrades and everything else.
Yeah.
Okay. Because that's the next thing that happens. If you are going through a ground up build, then there's a design meeting where you can change rooms, architecture. All of those things get added on. And depending on the builder, they're going to have stated what amount of additional deposit would be required. And that's before you even get to the options meeting, which is when you start picking out colors and finishes.
Yeah,
Which again, whatever that turns out to be, there's going to be some kind of additional deposit. With a quick move in, all of those decisions were made in advance. The home's already under construction. Really what you see is what you get. So those tend to go a little quicker that way because you already know what that final number is going to be. With standard new construction ground up, all of this goes into a builder. The builder has a sales agent, but that's not the person who legally signs for the builder. It's the builder's actual representative. So it could be a day or two before you actually end up under contract with the builder. A smaller builder like J. Thomas Homes could be that same day. Larger builder like DR Horton, it could be a day or two. What could actually be happening is 2 or 3 sales agents are all putting in offers on the same unit at the same time from different offices. So your buyer needs to be aware of that. Well, the one that you were going to look at, one under contract this morning, the one right next to it happened was almost.
He was putting it on the MLS, like, well, I was talking to him, so.
The builder says, we're gonna take, yeah, great, that happens. Builders are active on the weekend. Most large builders, their sales office is open Saturdays because that's when they know people are out looking. And so Mondays for them are just as hectic as us because now they got to sort through everything that happened over the weekend. If you're working with a client who's looking at one of the large builders and they said, hey, I want to go look at Ivory, then come talk to us because we've got copies of most of the large builders' contracts. So you can take a look at it in advance and have some preparation and not walk into it blind.
Yeah. That's super helpful.
Yeah.
I know my client was asking me that. And I didn't realize you guys had copies of that,
okay,
but by the time they wanted to transact, which ended up being really quickly. You know, we were already sitting in front of the sales guy, and then the contract right there, so.
yeah. That happens sometimes. I've had that happen before. My buyer with Fieldstone was the first time I've been with Fieldstone, and they're like, okay, we're ready to go right now. Okay, fine, then I'm gonna be reading this contract with you. And then the unique thing about, depending on if it's quick move in, typically you're not gonna have to worry about the deadline for design meeting and options meetings. Most builders are going to put in theirs that the buyer has to pre-qualify with the preferred lender. They cannot legally obligate the buyer to use that lender, but the lender's going to throw all kinds of incentives at them. If they're already pre-qualified with a lender, ask them to get a copy of the offer sheet from the preferred lender and send it to their other loan officer and say, here's what they're offering. What they really need to look at isn't just the lending percentage, but the APR. Yeah, they may offer you $3,000 toward the cabinets, but you're paying a higher interest rate to do that. Or you're paying higher fees. They'll make the money up somewhere. They're not just giving you $3,000. New construction for land. This one has some aspects of it that may not look familiar because it hasn't been updated as recently as the REPC for homes. And that has to do with the disposition of earnest money when it has to be provided. And the way that it's worded on the contract. On the standard REPC for, it simply states that we have up to 4 days after acceptance to provide the earnest money. This is the old school version of the form. You're either going to be marking that they are offering the earnest money, providing it today with the offer, or agrees to provide it within 4 calendar days. That's different from what you're used to seeing at the top of the standard REPC, where it just says agrees to deliver no later than 4 days. The land one hasn't been updated that way yet. So just be aware that you're going to have, it is a mark which one your client's choosing to do. Provide the earnest money with the offer or after acceptance within 4 calendar days. The amount is still negotiable and the form is still negotiable.
I think you use earnest money, they're doing a 1031 exchange for it, so they didn't put,
Yep. Earnest money is entirely negotiable. You can put a zero in there. You can do anything you want. Marty's had one was $50. Now, in terms of liquidated damages, that barely pays the postage, but it works. The other difference you'll see here is in the event that your client chooses to provide the earnest money at the time of the offer, this serves as the earnest money receipt. You fill in the brokerage phone number and who signed, if you received it. Otherwise, it's the more traditional, once they bring it in, then we fill out a digital earnest money receipt here. Property. Property descriptions can be a little different on these, primarily because not all properties have a mailing address. Your land deal, what did you use without a mailing address?
the parcel ID numbers.
Okay, parcel ID numbers are the preferred method because those are a recorded device specific to one property. On the standard REPC for buying a home, the reason we have to put an address and tax ID number is that mailing addresses could be duplicated. You can have a 123 Main Street in any town in Utah. You can only have one property with a specific tax ID number. So it may be that all you have is in the also described as line, parcel ID numbers. There are inclusions and exclusions as necessary with the land rep C. Are they including portable items? Horse property or agricultural property that has temporary stalls? Or a temporary corral? Is that going to stay? Is that going to go? Water service is important on this one. They are going to get into the terms of the water source for culinary and irrigation. Okay, what's culinary water? Okay, and then irrigation obviously is
Just straight irrigation water, because we have pressurized irrigation and separate culinary water, so our pressurized irrigation gets shut off. In the winter time, and then turns back on water.
so even on residential, it's that way because there are some areas that now have a pressurized secondary water system for the sprinklers that's separate from the culinary. It's safe for human contact. You just don't want the kids drinking it because it hasn't had to meet all of the clearances the drinking water does. In other words, it hasn't been chlorinated or fluoridated. And it's less expensive. It's not secondary water. It's called secondary water, but it's not gray water. It's not like you flushed it and it went out into the sprinkling system. Okay. The following water rights or shares, if applicable, are specifically excluded from the sale. If water rights or shares are not excluded, the contract assumes that water rights will be transferred. So here's the obvious question. Why is it worded that way? Why is it, the contract assumes water rights are staying unless excluded? So can water rights be excluded?
Yes, so if it's like a well permit or something that they had gotten for the land and they can use it on another piece of their property, they could exclude it. Where there are water shares that are included, I still think it's a good idea to list them, even though it says you don't need to. So we didn't on the original because I accidentally filled out the excluded instead of the included when I included the 0.87 shares of strawberry water that it's included, 0.87, and so per acre. And so I did an addendum and then spelled it out on there just so that it's more clear, because what if for some reason they come back and they're like, well, Heather, you said that the water shares were included and now there's only this many shares, but you know, and what if she doesn't remember how many shares I had included?
Yep.
I want to have it just black and white so that there's.
For clarification's sake, it is always good to include an addendum that spells that out specifically, because there is a difference between a water right and a water share. Where a water share is with an irrigation company, a water right is through the state of Utah, and you have the right to use a certain amount of water. They're usually measured different ways as well. Irrigation water that's flowing is measured by cubic feet per second. Water coming out of a well is measured by gallons or acre feet.
Yeah.
So they're two different instruments measuring two different things, measuring the same thing, water, two different ways from two different legal sources. So the more specific you are, the more protected your buyer and seller will be to make sure there's not a disagreement. A seller can choose to withhold the water rights. Those are something they could lease to another landholder somewhere else or sell to someone else if they choose to as a separate property. Now you mentioned like the well permit on your situation where the well permit's already been paid for, the state has permitted them to dig a well. They paid $20,000 for it. I looked it up this summer for a client. It's now up to $35,000 for the permit from the state to dig the hole. That's not the cost to dig the hole. That's just to get permission from the state to dig the hole.
She wanted to build on it.
Yeah, she is going to build on it, but they get to live in their other house for 2 years, even though it's been bought and paid for, because that's when the tracks are gonna come through in 2 years.
Oh,
On her other property. That's why she sold it, so.
Okay. A lot of the rest of this is going to look fairly familiar in terms of settlement proration. The important one right here to pay attention to is if the property has been listed as greenbelt in the past. Doug, you ever heard that term before?
Greenbelt, I have.
What does it mean? Greenbelt is a tax deferred or tax rebate status that is offered to landholders that have large areas of open green land, typically in an area that's growing. So you'll see in the south end of the Salt Lake Valley and Harriman, there are still cornfields. That's greenbelt. That's maintained as green space. And in order to try to prevent them from selling it or to encourage them not to sell it into development, they're given a tax rebate toward the use of the land for agricultural purposes. Because it's a rebate that's gone back to that owner at the change of ownership, that status no longer exists. And the buyer may end up being held liable to pay back those rebates, or the seller may have to pay it back. And if the seller doesn't, the buyer just bought that rebate and gets to pay it back.
So what it really means, so like in layman's terms for me,
Mhm.
what it meant was, if they decide to take it out of greenbelt,
Mm-hmm.
then they would be responsible for that going forward.
Yep.
So I clicked on there that the buyer would pay for that, because if the seller, because if they decide to take it out of greenbelt, like when they build on it, then they will be responsible for those taxes.
Yep. They'll be held responsible for it.
Yeah, but if they keep it in greenbelt, there won't be.
We had a property in Duchesne County that was listed, we had listed. It was a total of 50 acres. 49 was green belted. They had built a new farm home, or new home on 1 acre of it 2 years ago. The county required they use 1 acre, but because that was now zoned residential, that 1 acre was not green belted, but the 49 around it was. So they were paying, they now had basically 2 parcels, the green belted and 1 parcel non-green belt. And so they, have to keep track of that. Possession is still negotiable. Title still has to be provided. The disclosures, there is a seller property condition disclosure for land. It's unique to asking questions about land. It has not been updated and made nice and neat like the home property condition disclosure, but we're getting there. Obviously, due diligence and appraisal, you're going to be checking. Financing, additional earnest money. You'll notice a lot of this starts to look similar because it's pretty boilerplate. Now, one unique thing with land that is a different type of purchase is an option to purchase. And that's exactly what it sounds like. You prepay for the right to buy the protected right to purchase the property. You don't own it. You just bought the right to exclude everybody else from a potential transaction while you go through whatever steps you need to either consummate it or walk away. But either way, that money's spent. So if your buyer put a $10,000 option on the property, she's saying, I'm paying $10,000 for the right to buy this if I like it, or walk away from it after having paid 10 grand. But it protects them in the sense that no one else can buy it out from underneath of them. Okay. Real quickly, we're going to pull up that one, There is also, would you quit? There is a separate commercial contract as well. If you're looking, wow, that is way off. Okay. If you're looking at using this one, then we'll sit down with it and go through it in depth as well as with Craig. Because a lot of negotiation with the purchase or lease of commercial land has already gone on long before you get to this point. Start with a letter of intent to the landlord with expressing what the intended use is, negotiating the terms of the lease or the purchase price per square foot, any of the details you need. have already been negotiated back and forth. And then a letter of intent is signed by both parties, and now you intend to fill this out, but you've already worked out the details. One of the biggest or my experience with this, one of the biggest delays can come, where to go, with the financing side of it. Yeah, but there we go. Buyer's right to cancel is based on buyer's approval of the content of the seller's disclosure, buyer's approval of the physical condition inspection, buyer's approval of a survey of the property, buyer's approval of all the applicable laws, property appraising for not less than the purchase price, approval of terms. You notice that it's a little more specific about under the due diligence what they can walk away from. From the financing side of this, you need be in very close contact with the lender, because different types of purchase loans are going to have their own requirements. If they're purchasing with an SBA loan, then they have to provide proof that for like ours, where we have multiple offices we're leasing out, the primary owner, the purchaser, has to demonstrate that they will be using at least 51% of the usable space of the unit to qualify for an SBA. So my friend bought one for his office that there was a 2-story townhome, and there was already a tenant in the upper level. He had to measure the size of the stairway and the shared bathroom to verify that the guys upstairs weren't using more than 49% of the actual floor space. It's like, why am I? I'm like, you're the accountant, do the numbers.
There's a reason.
There's a reason I'm not an accountant. Exactly. So that's one of those things to look at, is also making sure that it's going to meet qualifications. And the due diligence and financing deadlines on these really are months, typically months out. If you're going to have, especially if they're looking at changing any kind of zoning or development, anything whether it's going to be dealing with a city, where the city may only meet once a month. Yeah. There's an old Dutch saying, government and windmills are both the same. They both move slowly. So just know that these are, they could be some good high numbers. Just know that it's a little more work. And again, this is an opportunity where Craig has done this lots of times, to sit down with him and make sure, okay, what's our next step? Because your buyer's still going to have due diligence. It just is going to look different from what you're accustomed to. Physical inspection. I love Tony Garina and Inspector Tony. He does residential. I want a commercial guy in there that's going to do a commercial inspection. It's going to cost a lot more. It's going to take more time. Survey of the land may be necessary, more so than a residential where there's typically a fence line there, or at least survey stakes. Those types of steps they want to go through. Can they actually use it the way they want to, or is it zoned the wrong way? That's what one of my clients keeps running into is that, oh yeah, it's a great idea, but it's technically an entertainment, and we're in you want 10,000 square feet of flat floor space. That's a warehouse. So that you'll be working through those a little differently. As with any of these contracts, if there's a major change you want to make to it, or your client wants to amend a significant portion of it, then I would suggest you contact Ryan or another attorney and make sure that the wording really works. The last thing you want to have is a disagreement later on over wording that was considered vague. You're better off being more specific. Like you said, Heather, putting every single one of those tax ID numbers.
I represent the buyer and the seller, so I want to be extra careful, because I don't want either of them to ever be mad at me for something they didn't understand.
Mhm.
And I can always go back and be like, look, that's why I put this in there, so that you would understand, because at the end of the day, if both of these people are very happy with this process, then there will be more business, you know? And of course, I want them both to be happy. I want them to speak praises of me and not, wow, she's a dirty rotten, you know?
You are investing in your future and theirs.
Yes, yes. And
But-
bottom line is I do want them to be happy.
Yep.
Of course I do.
But where you're looking at, there's going to be transfer of things like wellhead and equipment. The more specific that is, the better. And on residential, by the way, I've had some agents where there've been, there's a fridge in the kitchen and a fridge in the garage, which one stays, which one goes. They were specific to the white GE fridge in the kitchen, serial number, blah, blah, blah. So that when you move in and suddenly there's a wrong fridge, you've got some justifications. Yeah. Okay. We are going to spend the rest of this week going through the REPC in detail by section. And how they fit into that contract to keys scenario. The big part with all of them is going to be the deadlines. But we're going to look at, paragraph 24 has some specific deadlines, but there are some other things built in there that refer to those deadlines. We always need to keep in mind as we're working with negotiating a contract as well as any changes to the contract. I like that Utah's puts all of the contract deadlines in one place. I worked with a California contract. The deadlines were on different pages.
Ew.
And but you had to have, and your disclosures, you had to have a fire risk disclosure, earthquake risk disclosure, flood risk disclosure, hazardous waste risk disclosure, and they were all dependent on the prior one and on those deadlines, and they were all in different parts of the contract. So we had to go through and find all of these deadlines in the contract and try to put them on one calendar. And it was Sonoma County in the midst of the fires. I'm like, the county's on fire. They just had an earthquake and it's raining cats and dogs. And you're in California, so everything's toxic. Just provide all four.
Mm-hmm.
That was fun. Okay. I'll plan on printing a copy of the REPC so that you've got one you can write all over. Write on these, because this is going to be your opportunity to ask the kinds of questions you're probably going to get hit with by a client. And you want to be able to explain it in a way that makes sense to them.
Yeah, right then, instead of, actually, I don't know what that means.
Brianna and I were joking this morning about explaining earnest money once again to a
I
client.
explained it like 4 times and it still didn't make sense.
And so she asked me to do it, and sometimes it's just a matter of repetition. And I finally got done with him. He said, okay, that makes sense. I said, you have to understand, I taught 12-year-olds for 20 years. That's the level I've learned to explain everything on. I said, nothing personal about you. That's just as far as my vocabulary developed.
Yeah.
And sometimes you have to get to that level. So repetition also helps. Okay. All right, Jason, we're gonna crash here in about a minute. So I'm gonna
Okay.
stop the recording.
Okay. I'll be in there tomorrow.